There are moments when time collapses, when 42 years of silence shatters with a single knock on a door. It was November 14th, 2024. The sun had not yet risen over the suburbs of metropolitan Detroit. Frost clung to the windshields of cars parked along a quiet residential street in Warren, Michigan, where ranch homes sat shoulder to shoulder, their porches decorated with fading Halloween pumpkins and early Christmas wreaths. Inside one of these homes, a man in his mid-60s slept, unaware that his past had finally caught up to him. At 6:47 in the morning, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled to a stop 3 houses down. Doors opened with barely a sound. Detectives in plain clothes and tactical vests moved with practiced precision, their breath visible in the cold air. Neighbors would later describe the scene as surreal, like watching a television show unfold on their own street, except the actors were real, and the stakes were devastatingly higher than entertainment. The lead detective approached the front door. He had been awake for 20 hours, running on black coffee and the electric anticipation of this moment. Behind him, his team took positions. 1 knock, 2. Then the authoritative announcement that would change everything. Detroit police. Open the door. Inside, a light flickered on. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and there he stood. A grandfather, a neighbor, a man who had lived an entire lifetime in plain sight. The detective looked into his eyes and saw recognition flicker there. A shadow of something ancient and terrible passing across his face before resignation settled in like fog over the Detroit River. 42 years. 15,330 days since a young life was stolen from the streets of Detroit. 15,000 nights that a family waited for answers that never came. Until now, as handcuffs clicked into place and the suspect was led to a waiting vehicle, neighbors emerged onto their porches, confusion and disbelief etched across their faces. One elderly woman clutched her robe closed against the cold and whispered to no one in particular, "Not him. There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. Science doesn't lie. DNA doesn't forget. This is a story that begins and ends in Detroit, a city that knows something about survival, about decay and resurrection, about the weight of unsolved mysteries. It is a story about a person who should have lived a full life but didn't, about a family that refused to let their loved one be forgotten, about detectives who inherited a cold case and would not let it stay cold, and about a community that thought it knew everyone on its streets, only to discover that monsters don't always look like monsters. To understand how we arrived at that November morning, we must travel back 4 decades, to a Detroit that was bleeding jobs and hope, where the auto industry was crumbling and crime was surging, and where one young person was about to vanish into a darkness that would last for 42 years. Detroit in 1982 was a city at a crossroads, caught between its glorious industrial past and an uncertain future that loomed like storm clouds over the Renaissance Center. The auto plants that had once hummed with 3 shifts of workers now stood partially silent, their parking lots half empty. Unemployment had climbed past 15%. Neighborhoods that had thrived in the post-war boom were now pockmarked with burned-out houses and abandoned storefronts. Yet amid this decay, life persisted. Families stayed. Communities held together. People still dreamed. And nobody dreamed bigger than 23-year-old Diane Johnson. Diane was born in Detroit's Herman Gardens neighborhood in 1959, the second of 4 children in a close-knit family. Her mother, Dorothy, worked as a nurse at Detroit General Hospital, often pulling double shifts to keep the family afloat. Her father, Robert, had worked the line at the Dodge Main plant in Hamtramck before the layoffs came. Despite the economic hardship pressing down on the city, the Johnson household was filled with laughter, gospel music on Sunday mornings, and the smell of Dorothy's sweet potato pie cooling on the kitchen counter. Diane was the family's spark, quick-witted, fiercely loyal, with an infectious laugh that could fill a room. She had graduated from Cass Technical High School in 1977, where she'd been a member of the debate team and the choir. Her teachers remembered her as whip-smart, always raising her hand, always pushing back against injustice in classroom discussions about civil rights and women's equality. She saw a bigger world beyond Detroit's city limits, but she never wanted to leave. This was her home. These were her people. By 1982, Diane was working 2 jobs, days as a receptionist at a dental office on West Grand Boulevard, and evenings as a part-time clerk at a Hudson's department store in Northland Center. The work was exhausting, but she was saving money. She had a plan. She wanted to attend Wayne State University to study business administration, to one day own her own company. "I'm going to put my name on a building downtown," she told her younger brother Marcus just weeks before she disappeared. "You watch me." She was also in love. His name was Kenneth Waters, a mechanic who worked at a garage on East 7 Mile Road. They'd been dating for 8 months, and he'd recently bought her a delicate gold necklace with a small cross pendant. She wore it every day, tucked beneath her blouse at work, visible when she changed into her casual clothes in the evening. Kenneth would later tell detectives that he'd been planning to propose at Christmas. He'd already bought the ring, a modest diamond solitaire that had cost him 3 months' wages. October 29, 1982, a Friday. The autumn leaves had turned brilliant shades of copper and gold, and the air carried the first real bite of the approaching Michigan winter. Diane woke at 6:30 in the morning in the bedroom she shared with her younger sister, Cheryl. She showered, dressed in a burgundy turtleneck and jeans, and clasped Kenneth's necklace around her neck. At the breakfast table, she ate a bowl of raisin bran while her mother packed her a lunch: a turkey sandwich, an apple, a can of Verner's ginger ale. "You working late tonight?" Dorothy asked, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Just until 8, Diane replied. "Kenny's picking me up after my shift. We're gonna catch a movie." Those were the last words Dorothy Johnson ever heard her daughter speak. Diane left for work at 7:45, walking 3 blocks to the bus stop on Mack Avenue. A neighbor, Mrs. Geneva Williams, saw her waiting there, headphones from her Sony Walkman covering her ears, bopping her head to music. The number 16 bus arrived at 8:03. Diane climbed aboard. Security cameras were not yet common in 1982, so there is no footage of this moment, but the bus driver, a man named Carl Henderson, would later recall her. She'd smiled at him, dropped her fare in the box, and taken a seat near the middle of the bus. She arrived at the dental office by 8:30 and worked her full shift without incident. Her supervisor, Dr. Howard Chun, remembered that she'd been in good spirits, chatting with patients, humming to herself while filing paperwork. She clocked out at 5:15 in the afternoon. This is where the certainty ends and the mystery begins. Diane was scheduled to start her evening shift at Hudson's at 6 o'clock. The store was 12 miles north, and she typically took another bus to get there. But she never arrived. At 6:30, her manager called the Johnson home to ask where she was. Dorothy felt the first cold finger of worry trace down her spine. Diane was never late, never irresponsible. By 7 o'clock, Dorothy was frantic. By 8, when Kenneth showed up at Hudson's to pick up Diane and discovered she'd never clocked in, that cold finger of worry had become a fist of terror squeezing Dorothy's heart. At 9:17 that night, Robert Johnson walked into the 5th Precinct on Mt. Elliott Street and reported his daughter missing. The officer at the desk took down the information with bureaucratic efficiency, but his expression suggested he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. Young woman, Detroit, 1982. The unspoken subtext hung in the air like smoke. She probably ran off with a boyfriend, probably got caught up in drugs, probably chose to disappear. But Robert Johnson knew better. "My daughter didn't run away," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "Something happened to her. Something bad." He was right. In homicide investigation, there is an unforgiving truth known as the golden window, the first 48 hours after a disappearance or murder, when memories are fresh, physical evidence is abundant, and the chances of solving a case are exponentially higher. After that window closes, the odds of resolution drop dramatically with each passing day. In October of 1982, as the Johnson family watched the clock tick past midnight and into a terrifying new day, that window was already beginning to narrow. The initial response from Detroit police was measured, almost cautious. Missing persons reports, especially involving adults, were treated with a certain procedural skepticism. Officers had seen too many cases where the missing person simply wanted to be missing, runaways, domestic disputes, people starting over. But there were details in Diane Johnson's case that elevated the urgency. She'd missed work, something her employer confirmed was completely out of character. She'd left behind all her personal belongings, her savings account untouched, her clothes and toiletries still at home. And there was Kenneth, her boyfriend, whose anguish seemed too raw, too genuine to be performance. By Saturday morning, October 30th, Detectives Raymond Cole and Patricia Hayes were assigned to the case. Cole was a 20-year veteran of Detroit's homicide unit, a heavy-set black man with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much death. Hayes was younger, sharper, one of only a handful of women in the detective bureau at that time, fighting every day to prove she belonged. Together, they began the methodical work of retracing Diane's final known movements. They started at the dental office on West Grand Boulevard. Dr. Chun confirmed that Diane had worked her full shift and left at 5:15 through the back employee entrance. He provided the names of every patient she'd interacted with that day. All of them were interviewed, all of them cleared. The office had a small parking lot, but Diane didn't own a car. She would have walked to the nearest bus stop, 3 blocks east on West Grand Boulevard, to catch the number 12 bus heading north. Detective Hayes canvassed that route, going door to door in the fading afternoon light. Most residents hadn't seen anything unusual. But one man, a retired factory worker named Luther Adams, remembered something. He'd been sitting on his porch around 5:30, smoking a cigarette, when he saw a young black woman matching Diane's description walking past. She'd been alone. But a few moments later, a car had slowed down beside her. A light-colored sedan, possibly tan or beige, American-made, maybe a Chevrolet or Ford. The car had kept pace with her for half a block, then stopped. The woman had approached the driver's side window. Did she get in? Hayes pressed. Luther Adams squinted, trying to pull the memory into sharper focus. I think so. Yeah, I think she got in. But I can't be sure. My eyesight ain't what it used to be. Did you see the driver? Not really. Just that it looked like a man. White guy, I think, but I couldn't swear to it. This was the first real lead, and it was maddeningly vague. A light-colored sedan. There were thousands of them in Detroit. A white male driver. A description that could fit tens of thousands of men. But it was something. It suggested that Diane hadn't simply vanished into thin air. Someone had picked her up. The question was whether she'd gotten into that car willingly, perhaps thinking it was someone she knew, or whether something more sinister had occurred. Meanwhile, Detective Cole focused on Diane's personal life. In missing persons cases, especially those involving young women, the circle of intimacy is always scrutinized first. Statistically, victims are most often harmed by someone they know, a partner, an ex, a family member, a friend. Kenneth Waters was interviewed extensively. He willingly submitted to a polygraph examination and passed. His alibi for the evening of October 29th was solid. He'd been at work at the garage until 7, then had driven directly to Hudson's to pick up Diane, arriving around 8. Multiple witnesses corroborated his timeline. Diane's family was interviewed, her friends contacted, her daily routines mapped out. No one could think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She had no known enemies, no stalkers, no rejected suitors harboring grudges. She didn't use drugs. She wasn't involved in anything illegal. She was, by every account, exactly who she appeared to be. A young woman working hard, dreaming big, and trying to build a future in a city that was crumbling around her. On November 1st, 3 days after Diane's disappearance, a patrol officer found her purse. It was discovered in an alley off Gresham Avenue, roughly 2 miles from where she was last seen. The contents were dumped out, her wallet empty of the $43 she'd been carrying, her identification scattered, her keys missing. But Kenneth's necklace was still there, the delicate gold chain tangled among lipstick and breath mints. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a devastating blow. It suggested robbery as a motive, but it also transformed the case from a missing person investigation into something darker. Detective Hayes held that necklace in her gloved hand, feeling the weight of its significance. Diane had worn this every day. She wouldn't have taken it off willingly. The clasp wasn't broken, which meant someone had removed it from her body carefully, perhaps sentimentally, before discarding the rest of her belongings. On November 4th, a jogger running through Palmer Park in Detroit's North End made a discovery that would shatter the Johnson family's dwindling hope. Partially concealed beneath a pile of leaves and branches, approximately 50 yards from the park's main road, lay the body of a young black woman. She was fully clothed, lying face down, her burgundy turtleneck stained dark with dried blood. Identification was quick. Diane Marie Johnson, 23 years old, had been found. The medical examiner's preliminary findings were brutal in their clinical precision. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation. Time of death: estimated between 6 and 10 p.m. on October 29th, likely within hours of her disappearance. Evidence of sexual assault: inconclusive but suggested. The killer had struck her multiple times with a heavy object, possibly a tire iron or crowbar, then strangled her to ensure death. Afterward, he dragged or carried her body into the park under cover of darkness and attempted to conceal it. Detectives Cole and Hayes stood at the crime scene as technicians photographed every angle, collected every fiber, bagged every piece of potential evidence. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the ground, nature already trying to reclaim this place of violence. Hayes looked at the spot where Diane's body had lain and felt the familiar weight of failure and determination settling over her. Someone had stolen this young woman's future. Someone had extinguished that bright, dreaming spirit. And somewhere in Detroit, maybe close by, maybe watching, that someone was still breathing free air. The golden window had closed. The first 48 hours had passed. But the investigation was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. Though no one standing in Palmer Park that gray November afternoon could have imagined it would take 42 years to finish what they were starting. The hunt for Diane Johnson's killer would consume months of police work, generate hundreds of pages of reports, and ultimately lead nowhere. But that ending was still hidden in the future. For now, there was only the grim work of seeking justice for a young woman who had dreamed of putting her name on a building downtown, and who would instead have her name carved into a headstone. There is a particular kind of death that occurs not in a moment but across months and years. The slow suffocation of hope, the gradual dimming of urgency, the quiet resignation that some questions may never have answers. This is the death of an active investigation becoming a cold case. For the Johnson family, it was a second murder, not of their daughter's body, but of the promise that her killer would face justice. In the immediate aftermath of Diane's murder, Detroit police threw resources at the case. Detectives Cole and Hayes worked 16-hour days, following every lead, interviewing every potential witness. The light-colored sedan described by Luther Adams became the focus of an intensive search. Police bulletins went out to every precinct. Auto body shops were canvassed, asking if anyone had brought in a vehicle for repairs that might indicate involvement in a violent crime. Dents in the hood, cracked windshield, blood on the upholstery. Nothing surfaced. The crime scene in Palmer Park had yielded physical evidence, but the forensic technology of 1982 was primitive by today's standards. Fibers were collected from Diane's clothing, synthetic strands that didn't match anything she owned, presumably transferred from the killer's car or clothing. A single hair, not belonging to the victim, was found clutched in her hand. She'd fought back, tried to take something of her attacker with her. But without a suspect to compare it to, that hair was just a strand of protein, inert and meaningless. It was carefully preserved, catalogued, and stored in the evidence room, waiting for a future that seemed unlikely to arrive. Blood evidence was present, but DNA profiling was still in its infancy in 1982. The first criminal conviction using DNA wouldn't occur until 1987 in England, and the technology wouldn't become standard practice in American law enforcement until the mid-90s. So the biological evidence from Diane's case was documented, photographed, and preserved in the hope that someday, somehow, science might catch up to justice. Detectives pursued traditional investigative methods with dogged determination. They compiled a list of known sex offenders in the Detroit metropolitan area and interviewed dozens of them. Several had weak alibis, but none could be definitively connected to the crime. They looked at unsolved attacks on women in the same geographic area, searching for patterns, similar vehicles, similar methods, similar victim profiles. A few cases showed surface similarities, but nothing concrete enough to establish a serial offender. Kenneth Waters, despite having passed a polygraph and possessing a solid alibi, was investigated again. This was standard procedure, and he understood, but it added insult to the injury of his grief. His life became an open book, his finances examined, his past relationships scrutinized, his whereabouts on October 29 verified and re-verified. He was clean. The investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find. He was simply a young man who had lost the woman he loved and who would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. As winter gave way to spring and then summer of 1983, the leads dried up like puddles in August heat. The case file grew thick with reports that all ended the same way. Dead end, unable to locate, no further information available. The Johnson family called the precinct weekly, then monthly, desperate for updates. Detective Hayes took those calls, and each time she had to deliver the same painful message. We're still working on it, but there's nothing new to report. By 1984, the case was effectively cold, though no one said those words aloud to the family. Cole and Hayes were reassigned to new investigations. Detroit's homicide rate was climbing, cresting above 600 murders per year, and detectives couldn't afford to spend months on a single case that wasn't progressing. The file was transferred to the cold case unit, a small, underfunded division housed in a basement office with flickering fluorescent lights and boxes stacked to the ceiling. The 1980s were brutal years for Detroit. The population was hemorrhaging, from a peak of nearly 2 million residents in 1950 to barely 1 million by the end of the decade. Whole neighborhoods emptied out. The tax base collapsed. The police department faced budget cuts, hiring freezes, and crumbling infrastructure. The evidence storage facility, a warehouse on the city's east side, became a chaotic repository of unsolved crimes. Boxes stacked haphazardly, inventory systems that relied on handwritten ledgers, climate control that failed during power outages. The biological evidence from Diane Johnson's case sat in that warehouse, subject to heat, humidity, and neglect. The Johnson family refused to let go. Every year on October 29th, they held a vigil in Palmer Park, at the spot where Diane's body had been found. In the first years, dozens of people attended: family, friends, neighbors, community activists. Dorothy Johnson would stand before the assembled crowd, holding a framed photograph of her daughter, and plead for anyone with information to come forward. Local news stations covered the vigils in the early years, broadcasting Dorothy's grief into living rooms across metropolitan Detroit. But as the years accumulated, 5, 10, 15, the crowds shrank. The news cameras stopped coming. The city's attention moved on to fresher tragedies. Marcus Johnson, Diane's younger brother, never stopped calling the police department. Once a month, like clockwork, he would dial the cold case unit and ask if there were any updates. The answer was always no, but he kept calling. "I won't let them forget her," he told his mother. "As long as I'm breathing, they won't forget." By the year 2000, Diane Johnson's case file had been moved 3 times, surviving office relocations and evidence room reorganizations by sheer luck. The detectives who had originally worked the case were long retired. Cole had passed away in 1997. Hayes had moved to Florida after her retirement in 2003. The institutional memory of the case existed primarily in the Johnson family's grief and in a cardboard box in a dim warehouse, waiting for someone to open it and care enough to look inside. Detroit itself was transforming. Bankruptcy loomed, entire neighborhoods were returning to prairie, yet pockets of renaissance were emerging downtown. The city was learning to live with its scars, to carry its history of loss without being crushed by it. But some losses should never be accepted. Some cases should never be allowed to rest. Hindsight is a merciless teacher. Looking back at the Diane Johnson investigation through the clarifying lens of 4 decades and technological advancement reveals not incompetence, but rather the tragic limitations of an era, and the heartbreaking reality that the key to solving her murder may have been present from the very beginning, overlooked simply because the tools to recognize it didn't yet exist. But there were also human failures, decisions made or not made, that would haunt the case for decades. The original investigation, despite the dedication of detectives Cole and Hayes, operated within a system straining under impossible pressure. In 1982 and 83, Detroit was experiencing a homicide epidemic. The crack cocaine crisis was just beginning to take hold, gang violence was escalating, and the police department was overwhelmed. Detectives were carrying caseloads that would be considered unconscionable today. 15, 20, sometimes 30 active investigations simultaneously. Triage became necessary. Cases that showed immediate promise received more attention. Cases that stalled, like Diane's, inevitably slipped down the priority list. The light-colored sedan remained the most promising lead, but the investigation into it was hampered by the technology of the time. There was no centralized database of vehicle registrations that could be easily searched. No traffic cameras captured license plates. No automated systems tracked vehicle movements. Detectives had to manually cross-reference registration records, a process that would take weeks and required knowing what specific vehicle to look for. The description was too vague. American-made, light-colored, sedan. That could describe hundreds of thousands of vehicles in the Detroit metropolitan area alone. Luther Adams, the witness who had seen Diane approach the vehicle, was interviewed 3 times. Each time, his description remained frustratingly consistent in its vagueness. He couldn't recall any distinguishing features, no dents, no bumper stickers, no unusual characteristics. He couldn't say with certainty whether Diane had gotten into the car or simply spoken to the driver through the window before walking on. When detectives showed him a photo array of common sedan models from that era, Chevy Malibu, Ford Fairmont, Dodge Diplomat, he couldn't definitively identify which one he'd seen. "They all kind of look the same to me," he'd said apologetically. What haunts the case file, what jumps out to anyone reading it today, is a single interview conducted on November 7, 1982, 9 days after Diane's disappearance, 3 days after her body was found. A man named Thomas Blake, a 34-year-old auto mechanic who lived 4 blocks from where Diane was last seen, had called the police tip line. He'd been interviewed by a patrol officer, not by the lead detectives. The patrol officer's notes, handwritten on a standard form, documented the following. Thomas Blake reported that he had been driving in the area on the evening of October 29th. He drove a 1978 Chevrolet Malibu, tan in color. He'd seen news coverage of the missing woman and wanted to voluntarily come forward because he'd been in the vicinity and wanted to be cleared, so he wouldn't be harassed later. The officer noted that Blake was cooperative, answered all questions, and stated that he had gone to his mother's house for dinner that evening, arriving around 6:30 and staying until approximately 9 o'clock. His mother could verify this. The officer thanked him for coming forward, noted his contact information, and marked the interview as cleared, alibi verified. But the alibi was never actually verified. There is no record in the case file of anyone contacting Blake's mother to confirm his statement. There is no record of Blake being re-interviewed by detectives Cole and Hayes. The patrol officer had taken Blake at his word, filed the report, and moved on. In the chaos of an active homicide investigation with hundreds of tips coming in, this single interview fell through the cracks. Thomas Blake owned a tan Chevrolet Malibu, a light-colored American-made sedan. He'd been in the area at the exact time Diane disappeared, and he'd volunteered this information. A behavior that, while sometimes indicating innocent civic-mindedness, is also a recognized pattern among certain types of offenders who insert themselves into investigations to monitor police progress and deflect suspicion. Why wasn't Blake investigated more thoroughly? The answer lies in a combination of factors. First, the sheer volume of information flowing into the investigation made prioritization necessary. Second, Blake had no criminal record. A background check showed no arrests, no history of violence, no red flags. In an era before sophisticated criminal profiling and behavioral analysis became standard practice, a clean record carried significant weight. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Blake had come forward voluntarily. The prevailing investigative wisdom at the time held that guilty parties typically avoided contact with police. They didn't walk into precincts offering information. This wisdom, of course, would later be proven wrong in case after case. From Dennis Rader, the BTK killer who sent taunting letters to police, to Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer who passed polygraphs and inserted himself into search parties. But in 1982, that understanding was not yet part of standard investigative practice in Detroit. There were other missed opportunities scattered through the case file like unexploded ordnance. A call had come in from a woman named Sandra Pierce 3 weeks after the murder. She'd reported that her ex-boyfriend had come home on the night of October 29th with scratches on his face and what looked like blood on his jacket. She'd broken up with him shortly after because his behavior had frightened her. She'd been reluctant to call, she told the officer, because she wasn't sure if it meant anything and she didn't want to get him in trouble if it was innocent. The ex-boyfriend's name was documented, but there's no record of follow-up. The tip was categorized as vague, insufficient information to pursue. The physical evidence collected from the crime scene represented another realm of missed opportunity, not through any fault of the investigators, but simply because science hadn't caught up yet. The hair found in Diane's hand, the fiber evidence, the biological samples, all of this was meticulously preserved, but couldn't be analyzed in any meaningful way. The hair could be examined under a microscope for general characteristics, color, texture, racial origin, but this provided only the broadest classifications. Without a suspect to compare it to, it told investigators almost nothing. What's particularly frustrating when examining the case file is the presence of a detailed autopsy report that noted the collection of fingernail scrapings from the victim. Diane had defensive wounds on her hands. She'd fought her attacker. Beneath her fingernails, the medical examiner found biological material, skin cells that almost certainly belonged to her killer. This evidence was carefully preserved, sealed in evidence bags, and stored. But in 1982, there was no way to extract a DNA profile from skin cells. The technology simply didn't exist. So this piece of evidence, which, as we'll later see, would become the key to solving the case, sat in storage for decades, its true significance unrealized. The investigation also struggled with witness coordination. Multiple people had reported seeing a man in Palmer Park on the evening of October 29th, walking alone near where Diane's body would later be found. These reports came in over several days from different sources and were documented by different officers. But no one synthesized this information into a comprehensive timeline or attempted to compile a composite description. One witness described a white male, medium build, wearing a dark jacket. Another described a white male, tall, wearing jeans and a baseball cap. Were these the same person? Different people? The killer? Innocent park visitors? The reports were filed but never fully analyzed. Perhaps the most haunting document in the case file is a memo dated April 5, 1983, written by Detective Raymond Cole to his supervisor. In it, he expressed frustration with the lack of progress and recommended several avenues for continued investigation, including re-interviewing all individuals who had voluntarily contacted police, with special attention to anyone who owned a vehicle matching the witness description. The memo specifically mentioned Thomas Blake by name, noting that his alibi should be confirmed independently. The memo was acknowledged, filed, and apparently never acted upon. By April of 1983, the case was already drowning in the tide of new homicides. Resources were being redirected. The window had closed, and the darkness had settled in. Looking back, it's easy to judge these decisions harshly. But the detectives working Diane Johnson's case weren't negligent or incompetent. They were drowning, doing their best in an impossible situation with inadequate resources and technology that was decades behind where it needed to be. They collected evidence that their era couldn't analyze. They pursued leads that their systems couldn't track. They cared about getting justice for Diane Johnson, but caring isn't always enough. The tragedy isn't that mistakes were made. The tragedy is that the information needed to solve the case was there, documented, preserved, waiting, and it would sit waiting for 4 decades before anyone would look at it with fresh eyes and the tools to finally see what had been invisible for so long. Thomas Blake's interview report, that single page filled with a patrol officer's handwriting, remained in the case file. His name, his address, his tan Chevrolet Malibu, his unverified alibi. All of it sitting in a box in a warehouse, a ghost haunting the margins of justice, waiting for someone to notice. Every resurrection begins with a discovery. Sometimes it's dramatic, a body unearthed, a witness who suddenly remembers. But more often, it's quiet, almost mundane. A file found in a forgotten drawer, a box noticed during an inventory check, a name that catches someone's eye while searching for something else entirely. For the Diane Johnson case, resurrection came in the form of Detective Marcus Holloway, a 36-year-old investigator with Detroit's cold case unit, and a dusty cardboard box in a basement evidence facility on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 2021. Holloway hadn't been looking for Diane's case specifically. He'd been assigned a different cold case from 1997 and had been searching the evidence warehouse for the corresponding box. The facility, a sprawling single-story building on Detroit's east side, housed decades of unsolved crimes. Rows of industrial shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with boxes bearing evidence numbers, case numbers, and dates scrawled in fading marker. The climate control was unreliable, the organization was haphazard, and finding anything required patience, determination, and luck. Holloway was methodical. He worked his way through the section housing 1990s cases, checking numbers against his list, when his eye caught a box on a lower shelf that seemed out of place. The evidence number didn't match the sequence around it. He pulled it out, blew dust from the lid, and read the label. Case 82 to 6847, Johnson, Diane M. Homicide, October 1982. He hadn't been looking for it, but he couldn't look away. Holloway had grown up hearing about the Johnson case. It was part of Detroit's dark folklore, one of those unsolved murders that older officers mentioned when talking about the bad old days, about cases that haunted them, about the ones that got away. He'd never worked it, never read the file, but he knew the basics. Young woman murdered in Palmer Park, never solved. He opened the box. Inside was the detritus of an investigation frozen in time. Evidence bags with yellowed labels. Photographs in manila envelopes. A thick case file bound with rubber bands that disintegrated at his touch. Holloway carried the box to a processing table and began carefully cataloging the contents. Crime scene photos showed Diane's body, the surrounding area, the position of leaves and branches. Evidence bags contained the fiber samples, the hair, the fingernail scrapings. And there, at the bottom of the box, was a sealed envelope marked biological evidence, preserved for future analysis. Holloway held that envelope up to the fluorescent light. Inside were swabs and slides containing DNA, the killer's DNA, that had never been properly analyzed because the technology hadn't existed when the evidence was collected. But now, in 2021, that technology was not only available, it had advanced to the point where miracles were becoming routine. Cases that had been unsolvable for decades were being cracked using forensic genetic genealogy, the same method that had identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. But before DNA could work its magic, Holloway needed to understand the investigation itself. He took the case file back to his office and read it cover to cover. He read Cole's reports, Hayes's interviews, the autopsy findings, the dead-end leads. And then he found it, the interview with Thomas Blake, the man with the tan Malibu, the unverified alibi, the voluntary contact with police. Holloway's instincts, honed by 15 years in law enforcement, started tingling. He ran Blake's name through the modern database systems that hadn't existed in 1982. Thomas Blake was still alive, now 76 years old, living in Warren, Michigan. He'd never been arrested for anything beyond a speeding ticket. He'd worked as an auto mechanic for 30 years before retiring. He was, by all appearances, an ordinary citizen. But Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that Cole's instinct in that 1983 memo had been correct. This man should have been investigated more thoroughly. The problem was, for decades had passed. Witnesses were dead. Memories were gone. The only truth left was biological. Holloway wrote a detailed report to his supervisor, requesting authorization to send the preserved DNA evidence to the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory for analysis and to initiate forensic genetic genealogy procedures if a usable profile could be extracted. The request worked its way up the chain of command. Budget considerations were discussed. Forensic genealogy was expensive, often costing tens of thousands of dollars per case. Was it worth it for a 40-year-old homicide? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Johnson was still alive, now 91 years old, still living in Detroit, still lighting a candle for her daughter every October 29th. When she received a call from Detective Holloway explaining that the case was being reopened, that new technology might finally provide answers, she wept on the phone. "I've been waiting 40 years, she said, her voice shaking. "I want to know before I die. Please, I need to know." That phone call was forwarded to the chief of police. Budget was found. Authorization was granted. In April of 2021, the biological evidence from Diane Johnson's murder was sent to the lab with one simple instruction: extract a DNA profile and find a match. The box that had sat in a basement for nearly 4 decades had finally been opened. The evidence that had waited patiently for science to catch up was about to speak. And Thomas Blake, who had lived a quiet life for 40 years, who had believed his secret was buried with his victim, had no idea that the past was about to reach out and grab him. DNA is patient. It doesn't decay like memory or fade like ink on paper. Locked within the double helix of its structure is truth, immutable, objective, waiting to be read. In the spring of 2021, as the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory received the biological evidence from the Diane Johnson case, that truth was about to be translated from molecular code into human justice. The lead forensic scientist assigned to the case was Dr. Angela Chun, a specialist in degraded DNA analysis with 15 years of experience coaxing genetic profiles from evidence that many would consider hopeless. She'd worked on some of Michigan's most challenging cold cases, extracting usable DNA from decades-old bloodstains, bone fragments, and biological samples that had been stored in less than ideal conditions. When she opened the evidence package from the Johnson case and saw material collected in 1982, she knew she was facing one of the most challenging assignments of her career. The primary sample was the fingernail scrapings taken during Diane's autopsy. When Diane fought her attacker, when she clawed at his face or arms in those final desperate moments, she trapped cells of his skin beneath her nails. Those cells had been carefully collected, placed on microscope slides, and sealed. For nearly 40 years, they'd been waiting. The challenge was degradation. DNA, while stable compared to other biological materials, does break down over time, especially when exposed to heat, moisture, and oxygen. The evidence warehouse had experienced power failures over the decades, periods when climate control failed, temperature fluctuations that could have damaged the delicate molecular structures. Dr. Chun prepared herself for the possibility that the sample might be too degraded to yield a complete profile. But forensic science in 2021 was exponentially more sophisticated than even a decade earlier. New extraction techniques could isolate DNA from smaller and smaller samples. New amplification methods could take a tiny fragment of genetic material and replicate it millions of times for analysis. And new sequencing technologies could read damaged DNA that older methods would have dismissed as unusable. Dr. Chun worked with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a monk. She rehydrated the dried biological material, used enzymatic processes to break down cellular structures while preserving the DNA, and employed specialized extraction kits designed specifically for degraded samples. The process took weeks. Each step was documented, photographed, and peer-reviewed by colleagues to ensure nothing was missed. Finally, in late May of 2021, Dr. Chun had a sample ready for analysis. She loaded it into a genetic analyzer, a machine that reads the specific markers on DNA that make each person unique. These markers, called short tandem repeats, are like genetic fingerprints. The FBI's CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, uses 13 core markers to identify individuals. A match at all 13 markers is considered definitive proof of identity, with odds of a random match calculated in the trillions to 1. The analyzer ran for 6 hours. Dr. Chun watched the data populate on her computer screen, peaks and valleys appearing on a graph that represented the killer's genetic signature. And then she saw what she'd been hoping for but hardly dared to expect: a complete profile. 13 out of 13 markers. The DNA had survived. The killer's genetic fingerprint was intact. The first step was to run the profile through CODIS, the national database containing DNA from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. This is the standard procedure, the low-hanging fruit of forensic investigation. If the killer had been arrested for any crime in the decades since Diane's murder, if he'd been convicted of any offense requiring DNA collection, his profile would be in the system and the match would be instant. Dr. Chun uploaded the profile and waited. The search took less than a minute. The result came back. No match. This wasn't surprising. Cody's, while containing millions of profiles, represents only a fraction of the American population. Many criminals were never arrested or committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. But no match in Cody's didn't mean no options. It simply meant they needed to use the newest weapon in the cold case arsenal, forensic genetic genealogy. This technique had exploded into public consciousness in April of 2018, when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer after 40 years. The methodology was revolutionary. Instead of comparing crime scene DNA to convicted offenders, investigators uploaded the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, sites like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, where people voluntarily submit their DNA to trace their ancestry and find relatives. The science relies on a simple principle. Everyone shares DNA with their relatives. Siblings share approximately 50% of their DNA. First cousins share about 12.5%. Third cousins might share only 1%, but that's enough to identify the connection. By finding matches in the genealogy databases, even distant matches, investigators can build family trees backward to common ancestors, then trace those trees forward through descendants until they narrow down to a suspect. But this process requires expertise that sits at the intersection of genetics, genealogy, and detective work. The Detroit Police Department contracted with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The lead genealogist assigned to the case was Barbara Morton, a woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years researching family trees as a hobby before discovering that her skills could help solve crimes. In July of 2021, Dr. Chun sent the DNA profile to Barbara Morton. Morton uploaded it to GeneMatch, one of the largest public genealogy databases, and waited for the system to identify matches, people who shared enough DNA with the unknown killer to be related to him. The results came back within hours. There were 12 matches, all distant relatives, ranging from third cousins to fifth cousins. None of them were close enough to directly identify the killer, but they were close enough to provide a roadmap. Each of these matches represented a branch of a family tree that eventually converged on a common ancestor. Somewhere in that tree, among the descendants of those common ancestors, was the man who murdered Diane Johnson. Barbara Morton began the painstaking work of building family trees for each match. She scoured census records, birth certificates, death records, marriage licenses, obituaries, and old phone books. She traced lines backward through generations, from the matches born in the 1970s and 80s, to their parents born in the 50s and 60s, to grandparents born in the 20s and 30s. And there, in the early 1900s, she found the convergence point, a couple who'd immigrated to Michigan from Poland in 1912. This couple was the great-great-grandparents of multiple DNA matches. Every descendant of this couple was potentially related to the killer. Now came the elimination process. Morton traced every branch of this family tree forward to the present day, identifying hundreds of descendants. Then she began eliminating based on known facts about the killer. The DNA indicated male, so all females were eliminated. The killer would have been an adult in 1982, so anyone born after approximately 1965 was eliminated. The crime occurred in Detroit, so descendants who'd never lived in Michigan were eliminated. The list shrank. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became 20. 20 became 5. And then, as Morton cross-referenced the remaining names with addresses, vehicle registrations, and background information, one name jumped out at her with electric clarity. Thomas Blake. Born January 7, 1948. Lived in Detroit in 1982. Owned a 1978 Chevrolet Malibu, tan in color. And, this was the detail that made her hands shake as she typed her report, had voluntarily contacted police 9 days after Diane Johnson's murder. Morton immediately contacted Detective Holloway. "I think I found him," she said. "And he's already in the case file." The moment when data crystallizes into a name, when abstract genetic markers resolve into a human suspect, is the alchemy of modern forensic investigation, science transforming into justice. On August 3, 2021, Detective Marcus Holloway sat in his office at Detroit Police Headquarters, staring at Barbara Morton's report, and felt that alchemy occurring in real time. Thomas Wayne Blake, the man who'd driven a tan Malibu, the man who'd volunteered information, the man whose alibi had never been verified, the man who'd lived in plain sight for 40 years was now connected by DNA to Diane Johnson's murder through an intricate web of genetic relationships that spanned generations. But the connection wasn't direct. That was crucial to understand. The DNA from the crime scene didn't match any profile in a database. Instead, forensic genealogy had identified 12 distant relatives of the killer, then traced their family trees backward to find common ancestors, and forward through hundreds of descendants to identify Thomas Blake as the most likely suspect. This was powerful evidence, but it wasn't definitive. In court, defense attorneys could argue about the methodology, about the assumptions made in building family trees, about the possibility of error. What Holloway needed was confirmation, a direct DNA match between Thomas Blake and the crime scene evidence. And to get that, he needed Blake's DNA without alerting him to the investigation. If Blake knew he was a suspect, he might flee, destroy evidence, or simply refuse to cooperate. The element of surprise was crucial. This meant surveillance and covert DNA collection, a technique that had become standard practice in cold cases but required patience, planning, and sometimes weeks of observation. The legal principle was established: DNA discarded in public places, like a coffee cup thrown in a trash can or a cigarette but left on the sidewalk, could be collected without a warrant because it was considered abandoned property. But collecting it required knowing where the suspect went and what he did. Holloway assembled a small team, 2 other detectives from the cold case unit and a surveillance specialist from the Special Operations Division. Their mission was simple: follow Thomas Blake, document his movements, and collect any biological material he discarded in public. The surveillance began on August 9th. Thomas Blake lived in a modest ranch home on a quiet street in Warren, a northern suburb of Detroit. The house was well maintained, grass neatly trimmed, siding recently painted, an American flag hanging by the front door. Blake was 73 years old, a widower. His wife had died of cancer in 2015. His 3 adult children lived out of state. He was retired, living on Social Security and a small pension from his years as a mechanic. To all appearances, he was simply an elderly man living out his final years in peace. The surveillance team watched as Blake followed a routine that rarely varied. Each morning around 8, he walked out to the driveway to collect his newspaper. Around 9:30, he drove his 2014 Ford Focus to a McDonald's 3 blocks away, where he ordered a coffee and sat reading the paper for an hour. This was the opportunity the team had been waiting for. On the morning of August 11th, Detective Holloway and his partner arrived at the McDonald's before Blake. They sat in an unmarked vehicle in the parking lot and watched as Blake's Ford Focus pulled in at 9:37. Blake entered the restaurant, emerged 5 minutes later with a coffee in a paper cup, and took his usual seat by the window. 43 minutes later, he stood, threw his cup in the trash receptacle near the door, and left. Holloway waited until Blake's car had pulled out of the parking lot and turned the corner. Then he entered the restaurant, approached the trash receptacle, and carefully extracted the paper cup Blake had discarded. The cup had Blake's saliva on the rim and lip. It was carefully placed in an evidence bag, sealed, documented, and transported to the forensic laboratory within 2 hours. The DNA extraction was straightforward. Saliva is an excellent source of genetic material. Dr. Angela Chin processed the sample and generated a full DNA profile. Now came the moment of truth, the comparison that would either confirm Barbara Morton's genealogical investigation or send the case back into uncertainty. Dr. Chun loaded both profiles into her analysis software. The DNA from Diane Johnson's fingernails on one side, the DNA from Thomas Blake's coffee cup on the other. She initiated the comparison algorithm. The match was immediate and absolute. 13 out of 13 markers. The statistical probability of this being a coincidence was approximately 1 in 7 trillion. a number far exceeding the entire human population of Earth. The DNA beneath Diane Johnson's fingernails belonged to Thomas Blake. There was no doubt, no ambiguity, no room for alternative explanation. Dr. Chin documented the match, had it peer-reviewed by 2 other forensic scientists, and sent the report to Detective Holloway on August 14, 2021. Holloway read it 3 times, letting the magnitude sink in. After 40 years of waiting, after decades of the Johnson family living without answers, after an investigation that had gone cold and been forgotten by everyone except those who refused to forget, there was proof. Irrefutable, scientific, objective proof. But proof was only the beginning. Now came the challenging work of building a prosecutable case. The DNA placed Blake at the scene and in violent contact with Diane, but a good defense attorney would ask questions. What else connected Blake to the crime? Was there any corroborating evidence? Could they establish motive, opportunity, and method? The DNA was powerful, perhaps even sufficient on its own, but prosecutors wanted more. Holloway returned to the original case file with fresh eyes. He looked at Blake's 1982 interview again. Blake had said he'd been at his mother's house the evening of October 29th. His mother would now be deceased. Holloway checked and confirmed she died in 2002. But were there other ways to verify or disprove the alibi? He began the meticulous work of reconstructing Blake's life in October of 1982. Employment records showed Blake had worked at Riverside Auto Repair on East Warren Avenue. Holloway found the owner, now retired and in his 80s, who remembered Blake vaguely but couldn't recall specific details about that day. Phone records from 1982 were long destroyed, but Holloway kept digging, looking for anything that might corroborate the genealogical and DNA evidence. Meanwhile, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office was briefed on the case. The lead prosecutor, Karen Williams, was a veteran with 25 years of experience and a reputation for successfully trying cold cases. She reviewed the evidence and gave her assessment. The DNA was solid, the forensic genealogy methodology had been validated in multiple courts, and the original case file, particularly Blake's suspicious voluntary contact with police, provided useful context. She authorized seeking an arrest warrant. On October 15, 2021, almost exactly 39 years after Diane Johnson's murder, a Wayne County judge reviewed the evidence and issued an arrest warrant for Thomas Wayne Blake, charging him with first-degree murder. The wheels of justice, which had ground so slowly for so long, were now turning with gathering momentum. All that remained was to take Blake into custody and to shatter the illusion of normalcy he'd cultivated for 4 decades. There is a particular tension that accompanies watching a suspect who doesn't yet know he's a suspect. A strange intimacy in observing someone's ordinary life while knowing that life is about to be irrevocably disrupted. For 3 weeks between obtaining the DNA confirmation and securing the arrest warrant, Detective Marcus Holloway and his team maintained surveillance on Thomas Blake, not just to collect his discarded DNA, but to understand the man they were about to arrest, to ensure he posed no flight risk, and to gather any additional evidence that might strengthen the case. What they observed was profoundly unsettling in its banality. Thomas Blake was, by every outward measure, an ordinary elderly man living an ordinary retirement. He had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1994. He didn't associate with known criminals. He attended a Lutheran church on Sunday mornings. He volunteered occasionally at a local food bank. His neighbors, when casually interviewed under the pretense of a community survey, described him as quiet, helpful, someone who kept to himself but would lend you his snow blower if you asked. This is the dissonance that makes cold cases so psychologically disturbing. The man who murdered Diane Johnson in 1982, who struck her head with brutal force and strangled the life from her young body, had simply gone home that night, cleaned himself up, and continued living. He'd gone to work the next day. He'd eventually married, raised children, attended their school plays and baseball games. He'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases. He'd grown old, and somewhere inside him, he'd carried the knowledge of what he'd done. The surveillance logs paint a portrait of routine. Blake woke each morning around 7:30. He made coffee using a Mr. Coffee machine visible through his kitchen window. He watched the morning news. Around 9, he typically left the house, sometimes to McDonald's for coffee, sometimes to a Kroger grocery store 2 miles away, occasionally to Home Depot where he browsed the tool section with the purposeless wandering of someone filling empty hours. On August 18th, the surveillance team followed Blake to Woodlawn Cemetery on the city's north side. He parked near a grave in the older section of the cemetery, walked to a headstone, and stood there for approximately 15 minutes. The headstone belonged to his late wife, Margaret Blake, who had died in 2015 at age 68. Watching through binoculars from a respectful distance, one detective noted that Blake appeared to be speaking to the grave, though the words were inaudible. When he left, there were fresh flowers on the headstone. This moment troubled the surveillance team more than they expected. It's easier to arrest a monster than to arrest a man who visits his wife's grave. But Detective Holloway reminded his team of the reality. Thomas Blake had also stolen 40 years from the Johnson family. He'd stolen Diane's future, the husband she might have married, the children she might have raised, the businesses she might have built. He'd stolen Dorothy Johnson's chance to see her daughter grow old. Whatever grief Blake felt for his wife, whatever redemption he might have sought in his later years, it didn't erase what he'd done. The surveillance also looked for any indication that Blake might flee or harm himself if he sensed the investigation closing in. Behavioral analysts advised the team to watch for sudden changes in routine, large cash withdrawals, purchase of weapons, or signs of depression. Blake's bank records, obtained via subpoena, showed regular monthly withdrawals for living expenses but nothing unusual. His routine remained stable. He gave no indication that he suspected anything. On August 23rd, Blake had lunch with one of his adult daughters, Melissa, who was visiting from Arizona. The surveillance team watched as they ate at an Applebee's, their conversation appearing cordial but not intimate. Melissa did most of the talking while Blake nodded and occasionally responded. After lunch, she hugged him in the parking lot. A brief, dutiful embrace, and drove away. Holloway wondered if she'd ever suspect what her father had done, or if the revelation would destroy her understanding of her own childhood. The team also revisited Blake's history, looking for any evidence of other crimes. This was standard procedure in cold cases. Once you identify a suspect in one murder, you look for patterns, for other unsolved cases that might bear his signature. Detectives reviewed unsolved homicides and sexual assaults in the Detroit area between 1980 and 1990, looking for similarities in victim profile, method, or geographic location. One case caught their attention: the 1984 murder of 21-year-old Patricia Delgado, killed in a similar manner, blunt force trauma and strangulation, her body found in Rouge Park. But the circumstances differed enough that a connection was uncertain, and the evidence was too degraded to extract DNA for comparison. It remained a question mark, a possibility that Blake's crime might not have been singular. The investigation focused on what they could prove: Diane Johnson's murder, while acknowledging that justice is sometimes incomplete, that some questions never get answered. As the surveillance continued into September and then October, the team documented Blake's movements meticulously. They collected additional DNA samples when opportunity allowed: a water bottle discarded after a walk through the neighborhood, a napkin thrown away at the grocery store. Each sample confirmed what they already knew. This was their man. On October 20th, Blake did something that suggested, perhaps, that guilt had never fully released its grip. He drove to Palmer Park, the location where Diane's body had been found 40 years earlier. The surveillance team followed at a distance, watching as Blake parked near the north entrance and walked into the park. He didn't follow the main paths but instead walked into the wooded area, seemingly without direction, as if searching for something or perhaps trying to remember. He stopped at a spot beneath a large oak tree, approximately 30 yards from the main path. This wasn't the exact location where Diane's body had been discovered, but it was close, within 50 yards. Blake stood there for nearly 20 minutes, his hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the ground. Then he turned and walked back to his car. The surveillance detective recording this noted in his log: subject appeared to be visiting a significant location. Behavior consistent with returning to a crime scene. Possible indication of guilt or compulsion. Whether Blake was experiencing remorse, reliving the crime, or simply walking in a park couldn't be definitively determined. But the timing was chilling. Just days before the anniversary of Diane's murder, and just weeks before police would execute the arrest warrant. On November 1st, 2021, the surveillance operation entered its final phase. The arrest was scheduled for November 14th, a date chosen deliberately, a Sunday morning when Blake would be home and unlikely to be near potential hostages or in a position to flee. The tactical team from Detroit Police's Special Response Unit was briefed. The plan was straightforward. Approach the house at dawn, secure the perimeter, knock on the door with a warrant, and take Blake into custody with minimal fuss. The final surveillance log entry, dated November 13th, noted, "Subject followed normal routine. No indication of awareness. No signs of flight preparation. Subject appears to believe he is safe. Recommend proceeding with arrest as planned." Thomas Blake had lived free for 15,330 days since murdering Diane Johnson. He'd watched the seasons change 40 times. He'd seen the world transform around him, the Cold War end, the internet emerge, Detroit decay, and begin to rebuild. He'd grown old in the belief that he'd gotten away with it, that his secret was buried with his victim. He had one day of freedom left, and he had no idea that his past, preserved in DNA and data, had already reached out from the darkness and was about to pull him back into the light where justice waited. In the end, justice often comes down to a single irrefutable moment, a piece of evidence so definitive that it strips away doubt and leaves only truth. For the Diane Johnson case, that moment occurred in Dr. Angela Chen's laboratory on August 14, 2021, when the DNA profile from Thomas Blake's discarded coffee cup matched the DNA extracted from beneath Diane's fingernails with absolute certainty. But the path from that scientific truth to actionable legal justice required additional layers of verification, documentation, and procedural rigor. The American legal system, particularly in capital cases and cold cases, demands meticulous chain of custody and multiple layers of confirmation before evidence can be presented in court. A single DNA match, while scientifically compelling, must be supported by documentation that accounts for every moment from evidence collection to analysis, ensuring that no contamination occurred, no samples were mislabeled, and no procedural errors compromised the results. Dr. Chun understood this requirement intimately. Her report documenting the DNA match between Blake and the crime scene evidence was 37 pages long, detailing every step of the process. She described the extraction methodology used on the decades-old fingernail scrapings, the specific reagents employed, the amplification cycles run, the sequencing technology utilized. She included photographs of the evidence at every stage, graphs showing the genetic markers, statistical calculations demonstrating the astronomical improbability of a coincidental match. But Dr. Chen's report was only the beginning. The Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory operated under strict protocols requiring independent verification of significant findings. A second forensic scientist, Dr. Robert Yamamoto, was assigned to review Chen's work. He re-examined the original evidence, extracted his own DNA sample from a different portion of the preserved fingernail scrapings, and ran an independent analysis using slightly different methodology to ensure the results weren't dependent on a specific technique. The wait for Yamamoto's confirmation took 2 additional weeks. Weeks during which Detective Holloway lived in a state of anxious anticipation. What if the second analysis contradicted the first? What if there'd been an error? The entire case hung on the reliability of that DNA match. On August 28, Yamamoto's report arrived. The conclusion was identical. 13 out of 13 markers matched. The DNA beneath Diane Johnson's fingernails belonged to Thomas Blake. The statistical probability remained 1 in 7 trillion. The 2 independent analyses, using different methodologies, had arrived at the same irrefutable conclusion. With the DNA evidence confirmed, the prosecution team shifted focus to building the narrative that would present this evidence in court. DNA is powerful, but juries need context. They need to understand not just that a match exists, but what it means, how it was obtained, and why it matters. Assistant Prosecutor Karen Williams assembled the case file methodically. She started with Diane's story. The victim needed to be more than a name, more than a statistic. Williams compiled photographs from the Johnson family showing Diane at different stages of her life, videos of news coverage from 1982 showing the community's grief, and statements from family members describing the 4 decades they'd waited for answers. The emotional foundation of the case was crucial. This wasn't just about science. It was about a stolen life and a family's decades of suffering. Next came the procedural documentation of the original investigation. Williams reviewed every report from 1982, every witness interview, every piece of evidence collected. She paid particular attention to Thomas Blake's voluntary interview with police, the fact that he'd owned a tan Malibu matching the witness description, that he'd been in the area at the time of Diane's disappearance, and critically, that his alibi had never been independently verified. Williams recognized that defense attorneys would attack this point. They'd argue that Blake was simply being a good citizen by coming forward, that he'd cooperated fully, and that the police had cleared him. But Williams saw it differently. She saw a suspect who'd inserted himself into the investigation to gauge police progress and deflect suspicion, a pattern seen in numerous criminal cases. She prepared a briefing on similar behavior by other convicted criminals, establishing that voluntary contact with police is sometimes a red flag, not a sign of innocence. Then came the forensic genealogy evidence. This was the newest and potentially most controversial aspect of the case. Forensic genetic genealogy had been used successfully in numerous convictions since the Golden State Killer arrest, but it remained unfamiliar to many judges and jurors. Defense attorneys frequently challenged the methodology, arguing it was unproven, unreliable, or violated privacy rights. Williams prepared a comprehensive briefing on the science behind forensic genealogy, including peer-reviewed academic papers validating the methodology, case law from other jurisdictions where it had been accepted, and expert witnesses who could explain it in accessible terms. She anticipated every potential objection and prepared responses. The DNA match itself was the centerpiece, but Williams also looked for any corroborating evidence that might strengthen the case. She found it in Blake's vehicle registration from 1982. Records showed he'd owned the tan Malibu until 1984, when he'd sold it to a junkyard. The vehicle had been scrapped, convenient for Blake, eliminating any physical evidence that might have been found inside it. But the timeline was telling. He'd kept the car for 2 years after the murder, then disposed of it, perhaps once enough time had passed that getting rid of it wouldn't seem suspicious. Williams also discovered that Blake had never left Michigan in the 4 decades since the crime. Most people move at some point for jobs, family, opportunities, but Blake had stayed within a 30-mile radius of Detroit his entire life. Williams theorized that he'd been afraid to leave, afraid that moving might somehow trigger scrutiny, or that he needed to stay close to monitor whether the case was being investigated. By late September, the case was ready for presentation to a grand jury. Michigan law allowed prosecutors to seek indictments through grand jury proceedings for serious felonies, and Williams believed this was the appropriate path. The grand jury heard testimony from Dr. Chun about the DNA match, from Detective Holloway about the investigation, and from Barbara Morton about the genealogical work. They reviewed crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and the original case file. On October 15, 2021, the grand jury returned an indictment. Thomas Wayne Blake was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Diane Marie Johnson. The indictment was sealed immediately to prevent Blake from learning about it before his arrest. An arrest warrant was issued, and the wheels of justice, which had turned so slowly for so long, began accelerating toward their conclusion. Detective Holloway made one final visit before the arrest. He drove to Dorothy Johnson's home, where the 91-year-old woman still lived in the same house where Diane had eaten her last breakfast 40 years earlier. Holloway sat in Dorothy's living room, surrounded by photographs of Diane, and delivered the news. "We got him," Holloway said simply. "We have the man who killed Diane. The DNA is a perfect match. We're arresting him next month." Dorothy Johnson, who'd spent 4 decades carrying grief like a stone in her chest, closed her eyes and wept. Her hands shook as she reached for Holloway's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank God. Thank you." The evidence was secured. The case was built. The indictment was issued. All that remained was to bring Thomas Blake to face the consequences of what he'd done on an October night 4 decades ago. when he'd believed he could kill with impunity, when he'd thought that time and silence would protect him, when he hadn't imagined that science would someday speak for the dead, and DNA would become an inescapable witness to his crime. November 14th, 2021, 6:47 in the morning. The sky above Warren, Michigan was the color of bruised steel, promising snow. Frost covered the lawns and windshields on Monterey Street, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant hum of early morning traffic on 12 Mile Road. Inside number 4327, Thomas Blake slept in the same bedroom where he'd slept for 30 years, unaware that his lifetime of freedom was measured now in minutes. 3 blocks away, a convoy of 6 unmarked police vehicles rolled to a stop. Detective Marcus Holloway climbed out of the lead car, his breath visible in the cold air. Around him, the arrest team assembled, 10 officers in total, including 4 members of Detroit Police's Special Response Unit wearing tactical vests. The plan had been rehearsed twice. Everyone knew their positions. This was a 73-year-old man with no history of violence beyond the murder they were arresting him for, but protocols existed for a reason, and no one was taking chances. Holloway carried the warrant in a folder tucked inside his jacket. He'd read it a dozen times, though he'd long ago memorized every word. People of the state of Michigan versus Thomas Wayne Blake. First-degree murder. The weight of those words, the culmination of 40 years and hundreds of investigative hours, settled over him like a physical presence. The team moved on foot, approaching the house from multiple angles. 2 officers positioned themselves at the back door in case Blake tried to flee. 2 more covered the sides. Holloway and his partner, Detective Sarah Kim, approached the front door with 2 tactical officers flanking them. Holloway knocked. 3 solid strikes that echoed in the morning stillness. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time, and announced in a voice trained to carry authority, "Detroit Police, Thomas Blake, open the door." A light flickered on inside. Footsteps approached, slow, shuffling. The gait of an elderly man roused from sleep. The door opened 6 inches, held by a security chain. Thomas Blake stood in the gap, wearing striped pajamas and a confused expression that might have been genuine or might have been performance. He was shorter than Holloway had expected, perhaps 5'9", with thinning white hair and deep lines carved into his face by 7 decades of living. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked harmless. "Can I help you?" Blake's voice was rough with sleep. Holloway held up his badge. "Mr. Blake, I'm Detective Holloway with Detroit Police Cold Case Unit. I have a warrant for your arrest. I need you to open the door fully and step outside." The confusion on Blake's face flickered, and for just a moment, perhaps a half-second, something else appeared there. Recognition. A shadow of something ancient and dark passing across his eyes before he managed to control it. His hands, Holloway noticed, began to tremble. A warrant? For what? There must be some mistake. Blake's voice had changed, higher now, threaded with something that might have been fear or might have been the indignation of innocence. "There's no mistake, Mr. Blake. I need you to open the door now." Blake's hand moved to close the door, an instinctive gesture of retreat, but Detective Kim's foot was already in the gap. "Mr. Blake, you can open the door and step outside peacefully, or we'll force entry. Your choice. You have 5 seconds." The math of his situation must have calculated quickly in Blake's mind, the futility of resistance, the reality that 4 decades of running had just ended on his front porch. He removed the security chain and opened the door. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Holloway instructed. Blake complied, moving with the slow deliberation of someone in shock. As Holloway placed handcuffs around his wrists, feeling the thin bones beneath papery skin, he spoke the words that brought 40 years of injustice to a close. "Thomas Wayne Blake, you are under arrest for the murder of Diane Marie Johnson. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning continued, each phrase a hammer strike driving home the reality. Blake said nothing. His head drooped forward. His shoulders sagged. As the officers led him toward the waiting vehicle, neighbors began emerging onto their porches, drawn by the flashing lights now activated on the police vehicles. Mrs. Angela Webster, who'd lived next door to Blake for 15 years, stood on her porch in a bathrobe, her hand covering her mouth. "Tom? What's happening? What did he do?" she called out, but no one answered. Blake was placed in the back seat of Detective Holloway's vehicle. As they pulled away from Monterey Street, Holloway glanced in the rearview mirror at his prisoner. Blake sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. He looked like what he was, an old man whose past had finally caught up to him. "Do you want to tell me what happened that night?" Holloway asked, his voice neutral, offering one final chance at confession. Blake's eyes met Holloway's in the mirror. For a long moment, silence filled the car. Then Blake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want a lawyer." Those were the only words Thomas Blake would speak that day. At Detroit Police Headquarters, he was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in an interview room. Public defender was called. Blake invoked his Fifth Amendment right and said nothing more. But his silence didn't matter. The evidence spoke for him. The DNA screamed his guilt. And 4 blocks away, in the home where she'd waited 4 decades, Dorothy Johnson received a phone call from Detective Holloway with 3 words she'd thought she'd never hear. "We got him." The wheels of justice turned slowly, grinding through procedural stages designed to protect the rights of the accused while seeking truth for the victim. Between Thomas Blake's arrest in November 2021 and the beginning of his trial in March 2023, 16 months passed. A seemingly endless wait for the Johnson family, but a necessarily deliberate process in the American legal system. Blake was held without bond, deemed a flight risk despite his age and lack of criminal history. The severity of the charge and the strength of the evidence against him meant that he would await trial in the Wayne County Jail, housed in a single cell separate from the general population due to his age and the nature of his crime. His defense team, led by public defender Robert Merchant, a veteran attorney with 28 years of experience, faced an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. 13 markers matched with odds of 1 in 7 trillion. But Merchant's job wasn't to prove Blake innocent. It was to ensure he received a fair trial and to challenge every aspect of the prosecution's case, looking for any procedural error, any violation of rights, any weakness in the chain of evidence. Merchant filed multiple pretrial motions. He challenged the validity of the forensic genealogy methodology, arguing it was unproven science. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a no-nonsense jurist with 15 years on the bench, held a week-long evidentiary hearing on the issue, hearing testimony from experts on both sides. Ultimately, she ruled that forensic genetic genealogy was scientifically valid and legally admissible, citing precedent from multiple other jurisdictions including the Golden State Killer case. Merchant challenged the collection of Blake's DNA from the discarded coffee cup, arguing it violated his Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches. Judge Reynolds disagreed, citing established case law that items discarded in public places are considered abandoned property and can be collected without a warrant. Merchant challenged the chain of custody for the 40-year-old evidence, suggesting it might have been contaminated or compromised during decades of storage. The prosecution produced meticulous documentation showing the evidence had been properly sealed, stored, and handled, with no breaks in the chain of custody. One by one, the defense's challenges were defeated. By February 2023, it was clear the case would proceed to trial, and the evidence against Blake would be presented in full. The trial began on March 6, 2023, in Judge Reynolds' courtroom in the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in downtown Detroit. The jury selection took 3 days, prosecutors and defense attorneys questioning potential jurors about their understanding of DNA evidence, their feelings about cold cases, their ability to be impartial. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 29 to 68, representing a cross-section of metropolitan Detroit. Lead prosecutor Karen Williams delivered an opening statement that was both emotionally powerful and clinically precise. She began with Diane, showing the jury photographs of a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her, describing her dreams, her work ethic, her family's love for her. Then Williams walked the jury through October 29, 1982, from Diane's last breakfast to the discovery of her body in Palmer Park. She described the investigation's initial promise, its frustrating stagnation, and its eventual transformation into a cold case that sat unsolved for 40 years. Then Williams pivoted to the science, explaining how biological evidence collected in 1982 had been preserved, waiting for technology to advance. She explained forensic genetic genealogy in terms accessible to laypeople, comparing it to how millions of people use ancestry websites to find relatives. And she explained the DNA match with devastating clarity. The DNA beneath Diane Johnson's fingernails belongs to that man, Williams said, pointing at Thomas Blake. Not probably, not likely, but with absolute scientific certainty, 1 in 7 trillion. There are only 7 billion people on Earth. Those odds exceed the entire human population by a factor of 1,000. Defense attorney Merchant's opening statement was more restrained. He didn't deny that Blake's DNA was present. He couldn't. The evidence was too strong. Instead, he planted seeds of doubt about how it got there. The presence of DNA doesn't tell us the whole story, Merchant argued. It doesn't tell us about context, about how that transfer occurred, about whether there might be innocent explanations that we haven't considered. It was a thin argument, and Merchant knew it, but it was the only path available. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days. Dr. Angela Chen testified about the DNA extraction and analysis, walking the jury through each step with charts and photographs. She was unshakable under cross-examination, calmly explaining that the methodology was sound, the results were verified independently, and the conclusion was inescapable. Barbara Morton, the forensic genealogist, testified about building the family trees that led to Blake. She explained how DNA matches to distant cousins had allowed her to identify common ancestors and trace descendants. Defense attorney Merchant pressed her on the possibility of error. Couldn't she have made a mistake in building those trees? Morton acknowledged that genealogy involves interpretation and inference, but the ultimate DNA match between Blake and the crime scene was direct and definitive. Detective Marcus Holloway testified about the investigation, both the original work from 1982 and the cold case reopening. He walked the jury through Blake's voluntary interview with police, his claim of an alibi that was never verified, and his ownership of a vehicle matching the witness description. Under cross-examination, Merchant tried to portray Blake's voluntary contact with police as evidence of innocence, but Holloway calmly rebutted. In my 20 years as a detective, I've seen perpetrators insert themselves into investigations multiple times. It's not unusual. It's sometimes a way to monitor what police know and to deflect suspicion. The emotional apex of the trial came when Marcus Johnson, Diane's younger brother, took the stand. Now 63 years old, Marcus testified about his sister's dreams, her kindness, the hole her death left in their family. My mother is 93 years old, Marcus said, his voice breaking. She's waited 40 years for this day. 40 years of not knowing. 40 years of wondering if justice would ever come. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, Diane's absence was there. And knowing that someone was walking around free, living their life while my sister was in the ground. It destroyed us slowly year after year. The defense called only one witness, Dr. Harold Brennan, a forensic scientist who raised theoretical questions about DNA transfer, suggesting that biological material could potentially be transferred through secondary contact. But under prosecution cross-examination, Dr. Brennan admitted that he'd reviewed the evidence in this case and agreed the amount and location of the DNA beneath the victim's fingernails, consistent with defensive wounds, was consistent with direct violent contact, not innocent transfer. Thomas Blake did not testify. The Fifth Amendment protected his right to remain silent, and his defense team advised him not to take the stand where prosecutors could cross-examine him. His silence was his right, but it left the jury with no alternative narrative, no explanation for how his DNA came to be beneath the fingernails of a woman he claimed, in his 1982 police interview, not to know. Closing arguments took place on March 22. Williams was powerful and emotional, asking the jury to remember Diane, to honor her memory by holding her killer accountable. DNA doesn't lie, Williams said. Science doesn't have an agenda. The evidence in this case is clear, overwhelming, and irrefutable. Thomas Blake murdered Diane Johnson 40 years ago. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He thought time would protect him. But justice is patient, and truth endures. Merchant, in his closing, made a final plea for reasonable doubt, asking the jury to consider whether the state had truly proven its case beyond all uncertainty. But his argument felt hollow against the weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days. On March 24, 2023, they returned to the courtroom. The foreman, a 54-year-old engineer, stood and delivered the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Wayne Blake, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Diane Marie Johnson. The courtroom erupted. Marcus Johnson collapsed into tears, embraced by family members. In the gallery, several people applauded before Judge Reynolds gavelled them into silence. Thomas Blake sat motionless, his face blank, as if he'd already retreated somewhere inside himself where the verdict couldn't reach. Sentencing was scheduled for April 18th. Under Michigan law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Reynolds allowed victim impact statements. Marcus Johnson spoke, as did several of Diane's former friends and community members. Dorothy Johnson, now 93 and frail, was too ill to attend, but her written statement was read aloud. I have waited 40 years for this day. I am an old woman now. I don't have much time left, but I can die knowing that my daughter's killer will face justice. Thank you. Judge Reynolds, a black woman in her early 60s who had grown up in Detroit during the same era as Diane, delivered a sentencing statement that was both measured and passionate. Mr. Blake, you stole a life 40 years ago. You stole Diane Johnson's future, her family's peace, and this community's sense of safety. You then compounded that crime by living freely for 4 decades while the Johnson family suffered without answers. Justice delayed is still justice, and today, justice is being served. She sentenced Thomas Blake to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Blake, now 75 years old, would spend whatever years remained to him in a state prison, dying behind bars for a crime committed when he was 34. As officers led Blake from the courtroom for the final time, he glanced back briefly at the gallery. His children, who'd attended the trial, sat with faces marked by grief and betrayal. They'd spent their lives believing their father was a good man, and that belief had been incinerated by DNA and truth. Justice had come 40 years late, but it had come. There is a grave in Woodlawn Cemetery on Detroit's north side, beneath an oak tree that has weathered 41 winters since Diane Marie Johnson was laid to rest. The headstone is simple, gray granite, her name, her dates, and an inscription chosen by her mother. Forever young, forever loved, forever remembered. On April 23, 2023, 5 days after Thomas Blake's sentencing, the Johnson family gathered at that grave. Dorothy Johnson, 93 years old and confined to a wheelchair, was pushed to the graveside by her son Marcus. She placed a hand on the cold stone and whispered words only she and her daughter could hear. Tears tracked down her weathered face, but they were different tears than she'd cried for 40 years. These were tears of relief, of closure, of a burden finally lifted. "We got him, baby girl," Dorothy said softly. "We never stopped looking. We never forgot you." The family stayed for an hour, sharing memories, speaking Diane's name, feeling her presence in the way that only those who've loved and lost can understand. When they finally departed, fresh flowers adorned the grave. White roses, Diane's favorite. Dorothy Johnson died peacefully in her sleep 7 months later, on November 3, 2023. She was buried beside her daughter, her headstone aligned perfectly with Diane's, reunited at last after a separation that had lasted far too long. Those who attended her funeral said that Dorothy looked peaceful in death. The decades of worry and grief finally released, her purpose fulfilled. The Diane Johnson case became a landmark in Michigan criminal justice, frequently cited in legal proceedings involving forensic genetic genealogy. It demonstrated that even decades-old cases could be solved when science, persistence, and justice converged. The Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit received increased funding in the wake of Blake's conviction, and dozens of other unsolved murders from the 1980s and 90s are now being reviewed with forensic genealogy techniques. Thomas Blake remains incarcerated at the Thumb Correctional Facility in Lapeer, Michigan. He has never confessed, never expressed remorse, never explained what happened on October 29, 1982. He exists in silence, an old man waiting to die, the DNA evidence ensuring he'll never see freedom again. Detroit continues its long, complicated journey of decline and rebirth. The city that lost hundreds of thousands of residents and thousands of homicide victims is slowly rebuilding. Neighborhoods are being reclaimed. The downtown skyline gleams with new construction. But the city remembers its lost ones. Diane Johnson among them. Names carved into memorial walls, stories preserved in archives, lives honored by those who refuse to forget. In Palmer Park, where Diane's body was found, there is now a small memorial garden dedicated to victims of violence. Her name is engraved there among dozens of others, a permanent reminder that every unsolved case represents a person, a family, a life stolen. And on a shelf in the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory, carefully preserved, sits the evidence that solved a 40-year-old murder. A small vial containing DNA that refused to decay, that waited patiently for science to advance, that ultimately spoke for a young woman who could no longer speak for herself. Justice delayed is still justice. Truth buried is still truth. And memory, when tended by those who love, never dies. Diane Marie Johnson dreamed of putting her name on a building downtown. She never got that chance. But her name is remembered, in courtrooms and forensic laboratories, in family stories and memorial gardens, in the history of a city that refuses to forget its own. Some cases are never solved. Some killers are never caught. But this time, against the odds across 4 decades of silence, justice prevailed. And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this world, perhaps Diane Johnson knows that she was not forgotten, that her family never stopped fighting, and that the man who took her life was finally held accountable. The echo of her loss still resonates. But now, finally, there is also an echo of resolution, of closure, of a promise kept to the dead by the living. Rest now, Diane. The waiting is over. Justice has come home.